Hello, everybody. I am Lanny, curator of UP Wild, and welcome to our discussion on how rediscovering God in the wild is essential to the future of the church. UP Wild Church is a means of encountering the actively living God based on shared values of faith, connection, and nature. And we create opportunities to foster a deeper spiritual connection with God outdoors and through virtual nature walks online. So, we are a community who openly prays for the healing of the land and our hearts. We allow for open conversation on our culture of consumption, and we celebrate our varied experiences and differences. We invite all into participation, as this has been from the very beginning and inception a cross denominational offering. So today, I'm going to speak to you in the true UP Wild form, which means that I will mix in some nature clips from our past wilderness walks. And for those of you that don't know, UP stands for Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And this is where we gather. It is where our walks are located. This is also the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, which we feel is important to acknowledge, for they were stewards of this land before we arrived, and we are called to walk together going forward. I'm also speaking from having been raised in an American setting of Western church mentality and that type of definition of wild space. And this truly is a compilation of voices, so it's not just mine. So let's begin by discussing what it means to rediscover God in the wild and how we can embody this as a spiritual practice. This video that I'm about to show you is made by UP Wild, and it's called Becoming Beholders, and it will guide us into our discussion.
How could I have not noticed you? How have I gone my whole life without seeing you? You've been here. You are here. You designed it all so beautifully. It's all here. Everything I need is here. Was I not taught the language of Nagizake? The language of the heart is eagle flying. If this is life, then what is this? Habitat destruction is causing extinction. Our appetites are causing climate change. We have taken over the world, like we are justified to do so. All of this is caused by human consumption, my consumption. Was it not foretold you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? That God is love, a love that calls me into relationship. All things that are loved into being. Love, then, is the ground of all existence. Do I accept you or reject your teachings? The leaves have not suddenly changed their colors, nor has the sky been transformed. All that beauty was already there. The splendor was there, but I did not notice it. So what has changed? I became a beholder, and I see what is there to be seen. To behold what is always present, I truly see and fully appreciate what is there. I can see the love that supports all that exists, that bedrock of your being and mine, and the being of everything about us. I aspire to be like you, to love like you love, to let go of what I've become, and step out of the window and into the wilderness to see the omnipresence of God in and throughout all things. Amen.
So, the everyday way we encounter and interact with nature can foster a deeper connection with God. It's like we knew that at one time, but it's lost along the way. So that's why I don't say discover God in nature, but really it's rediscovering God in nature. And all of us can do this. We can do this by rereading the scriptures to see how much God truly loves all of creation. We can sit in solitude and hear how creation praises God. We can look in awe and wonderment on how creation reveals God. And in our own way, in our own places, even if we can't get outside, there's always a nature, whether it's a little bug inside or a garden or a tree outside our window. We always have the opportunity to open the book of nature. So, a part of what we do at UP Wild Church is reclaim our connection with God's great congregation, roaming freely beyond the church walls. And Jesus deliberately spent time in the wilderness. And the fact that he did so shows us that there's an opportunity in nature that relates to our spiritual hunger for the presence of God. Between the beginning of Genesis and the end of Revelation, little known fact, or maybe you know it, but the term wilderness is mentioned about 300 times. It's a place of great significance because it's often the context for revelation, prayer, and the presence of the Holy Spirit. A relationship with God requires that we have a relationship with God's creation. For example, because we all love them, we hear them in the morning singing their praises, the birds. And I'd like to share a story with you from my life. I had just finished 6 years of university and was hitting the pavement looking for a job. And I knew that whatever I wanted to do, I wanted it to be in service of the other. But whatever I was applying to, it just never quite felt fulfilling. And I remember very clearly after a dream job interview, I was hurrying along the sidewalk of a busy Washington, D.C. street with so many things vying for my attention. And I heard the sound of some birds nesting in an urban tree. And they stopped me, like literally in my tracks, that I had to move out of this busy line of people. And there was something so appealing about them that I just stood there watching them for minutes. Now, I'll give you a little background into this momentary expert of my life. I had just walked out of an interview that was the culmination of years of hard work, late nights studying and writing dissertations and unpaid internships, conversation with family that had invested their support into the direction that my life was heading. And this was it. This job would begin the next path for me, but also a path of servitude, which inevitably would mean years behind walls of one office in one city to one office in the next city. And all that I thought, um, all that I had, all that I thought I was, and had created myself to be in this world was now standing on the street corner. And the only thing I remember thinking was, I wish I could stand here with these birds for the rest of my life. But I knew that I couldn't. I knew that I'd had to get back in that busy line of people and keep moving. And what was appealing about them, I think, was that they were free. So free that in what should have been this most exciting moment into this entrance of my adulthood, I felt a disconnect in my life that at the time I couldn't fully understand. But those birds were reminding me of God's presence. And the billboards and the beeping cars and the ways of this world were no match for the authenticity of an encounter with a being that is living proof that God is in our midst. So those birds reminded me of a connection that has been centuries lost, but that I hungered to reclaim. And that is that the whole of creation is my vocation. It's our vocation. Some of you may know Colin Cornell of Sewanee, and he shares this wonderful story on the importance of allowing Christians permission to nurture what they experience in nature. And he shares this story of, it goes like this. He says, one of my mom's spiritual practices is to watch the barn swallows that fly up every year from South America to her barn. Yet she has had zero encouragement about this experience, that it is so important to her spiritual life. So it remains disconnected from her life in the Christian community. And this is not uncommon. How many of us have felt this way? So I asked a few members of the UP Wild community about their spiritual practice of discovering God in the wild. And this is what they shared. It's another video where I followed some deer tracks in the woods. And let's take a look at that. We're going to screen share again.
When I walk into the woods with my family, I have a feeling of connection with not only the world around me, but with my own sense of self, my feelings of tapering of the emotional overload that I get in my life on a daily basis. And I also have a connection with my children. I think that something that I have been looking for in my life is a way to find a community of people that have an understanding of God and God's way, and the ability to relate that to the real world that we live in today. So looking for that guidance and that wisdom so I can teach my children this and have them understand that this is just a part of our life to be on this earth. And in addition to that, that we have to take care of this earth while we're here, because our spirit will go on and our earth will go on if we take care of it.
I remember this moment on 6th Avenue, right by Rockefeller Center, and the traffic was whizzing by, and just so much noise, and much everything going on, just tumultuous. And I remember looking up and seeing this monarch butterfly floating across the traffic, and at that moment it was sacred ground. It was realizing that with all of our power and all of our technology and all of our wealth and even all the desire, even if we wanted to, we could never ever create something as simple and beautiful as a butterfly. And in that moment, it was sacred ground. Even in the midst of all that tumultuous churning, I paused and watched the butterfly and knew that there was something bigger than myself.
I'm often asked why I spend so much time hiking and out in nature. And if I'm being honest with myself, it's because I'm thirsty for it. I seek time in nature because there's a hunger within me that can only be satisfied when I'm within that living world. There are times that I long for places like the desert, the expanses of rocks and sand in Utah and California, with colors so subtle you have to slow down. There are times that I crave the mountains for their solitude, for their majestic stance, their age and wisdom, and their humbling heights. There are times I wander in winter and delight in the snow and its silence. And there are times that I'm overwhelmed at the base of a tree as it grows up towards the sky and shoots its roots down into the ground. I'm not whole without it, without wilderness, without nature, without creation. I belong in it. I am a part of it. I don't feel this way when I'm standing on concrete or asphalt, or when I'm inside of a building. All of these were designed by humans and for humans. All of creation was designed by God, and we are included in that. God granted us stewardship of all of creation. I'm enchanted by the living world. I'm also overwhelmed. The scale can be too large to fathom. So I go hiking to be reminded of this great responsibility. I go hiking to reconnect to the living world. I go hiking to rediscover the wonder and the beauty. And I go hiking to be re-enchanted.
So let's just get out of here, get the next one queued up, and then we'll come back to you. There we go.
Right. So I think, unfortunately, there has been a hindrance into fully stepping into allowing ourselves to form this as a spiritual expression. And that when we enter into God's domain, which is the created order, in a sense, you remember who you are again. From dust you came, and from dust you shall return. So it's important to see reconnecting to our watersheds and wilderness areas as a spiritual practice, because then we understand that it was made by the maker of all life. So these areas are a source of life. And since they are life bearing, they are worthy and necessary for us to know, to gather around and in our day and age, unfortunately, to protect. If we don't act to protect and stand up for these sources of life, we allow the forces of death, which are not in God's domain, to take hold. And we risk losing more ecosystems and eventually our children's futures. But we also fail to live into our divine commission as created in the image of God. So, rediscovering God in the wild is a spiritual practice that allows us to once again begin to live in right relationship, which leads to our healing. And here is an example of how we can encounter Christ by going into the wild. It's another one of our wilderness walks. It's called Love the Trees.
I remember of hearing of an abbot of the monastery of St. John on the island of Patmos named Father Amphilochios. It is recounted that when hearing the confessions of the local farmers, he assigned to them as a penance the task of planting a tree. And through his influence, many hillsides of Patmos, which once were barren rock, are now green with foliage every summer. He used to say, "Do you know that God gave us one more commandment, which is not recorded in Scripture? It is the commandment, love the trees." He was convinced whoever does not love the trees does not love Christ. When you plant a tree, you plant hope, you plant peace, you plant love, and you receive God's blessing, he would say. The first step is to love the tree for itself, in terms of its own consistency and integrity. The second step is to allow the tree to become translucent, so that it reveals to us the indwelling Creator Logos. Love is at the center of our quest for holiness. This tree consists not in dead matter alone, but in living relationship. God is making the world, and you and me in it, right now, here, at this moment. Creation forms not only the basic raw material for shelter and warmth of humankind, but also the substance of the incarnation of God's Son. So love the trees. How should I do so? Is there a connection between the love of trees and the love of God? How far is it true that a failure to reverence and honor our natural environment, animals, trees, earth, fire, air, and water, is also a failure to reverence and honor the living God? Okay, so
Another one of our past wilderness prayer services, I read from the book Watershed Discipleship by Ched Myers, which states, if we have alienated ourselves from the earth, thus it is to the earth that we must return. We have allowed the earth and her life forms to be turned into commodities to be extracted and exploited. Industrial culture has rendered most of us, most Christians, unable to see the holy mountain. We have become more loyal to abstractions and distractions than to actually being grounded in the bioregions in which we reside. So let us remember that our loyalty to God and the good of God's creation supersedes all human ambitions. This type of discipleship can help us both forge a different human future that is sustainable, resilient, and just, and inspire the next great renewal of a church determined to live in the light. It offers the followers of Yahweh a path to, as Dorothy Day says, build a new world in the shell of the old. So let's briefly take a look into a clip from that service. And this is our last video portion. So let me get that prepared.
This question of why Christians are, or rather should be, water protectors is such an important one in this moment. For me, the degradation of our watersheds is indicative of a profound disconnection from the reality of human interdependence on the rest of the created world. And the crisis that this disconnection has created is also a theological crisis in my mind. We know that the central teaching of our tradition is to love God and love neighbor as ourself. And in that very short teaching, interconnection of God, self, and neighbor, which I say also includes non-human neighbors, is highlighted. That connection is highlighted. We can't be in loving, right relationship with the Creator without being in loving, right relationship with creation. These things seem dependent on one another. They're connected. And we must remember, too, that this interconnection we're called to is embodied. It isn't just a spiritual connection, but an enfleshed one. We remember that the divine came in flesh as Jesus. So this tells us that the material, the embodied, is important. And when it comes to water, the thing that makes up most of Earth and most of our bodies, we must see it and the creatures that live within it as an extension of our neighbor. We're called to love water as ourselves, knowing that in a very real way, protecting it protects ourselves. And we know that a relationship of care with water, our neighbor, helps us to be in more intimate and right relationship with the Creator God. We must, as Christians, see these things as connected, and we must strive to reverse the alienation of our present moment with practices of reconnection to water and to other essential elements of life.
And some of you might want to keep sitting there. I totally understand. You can find these on our YouTube channel or our website, UP Wild. But it's so relaxing watching those too. But this disconnect that Audra's talking about, this disconnect is felt deepest in the hearts of our youth, who are given really little to no guidance or ability to be empowered as earth keepers for Christ, because we aren't doing a good enough job of teaching them. So it is essential to the future of the church because it involves the youth. And this was as UP Wild found. So I want to share with you a little bit. The context of how we began was listening to the experiences and stories of young adults that I had grown up with within the church who no longer attended traditional services. There were a lot of them at one time, and then as I would go back to church in my later years, I would see none of them. And they all told me when I sat down and had a cup of coffee with them that their form of spiritual practice was to go outside for a hike or out on the boat in Lake Superior. And they shared this with excitement and joy, but also with a sense of shame because they felt it was separate from religion that they were formed in. But for many of them, these were moments shared with their family or their closest friends or even their animal friends. And they were times where no electronic devices were brought with them. They were left in the car or turned on silent mode just to take a picture. And these were moments they sought out to let go of the distractions in their lives. And they didn't carry them with them. They didn't carry into the woods their worries and their plans and their anxieties. And many times they ventured into the wilderness in silence, desperately wanting to encounter the stillness and peace offered by non-human creation. So almost all of them said that they were seeking ways on how to encounter the mystery which created all things, but they didn't know how. So this time of transition is especially imperative for the youth and the young families in our communities. After all, it's their futures that we're transitioning into. So UP Wild was really created out of asking the question, where have all the young people gone from our churches? And not just one church, not just the Episcopal Church or the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church, but across denominations, a common occurrence is happening. There's become this mass extinction of young people in the pews. Their classification evolving from vulnerable to endangered to critically endangered and to the forelooming extinct, right? So it's hard not to draw parallels with what's happening outside of the walls of our churches. For the youth, they are inheriting a world of climate extremes, of air and water pollution, chemical toxicity, ocean acidification, and a loss of natural medicinal remedies that are found in old growth forests. Of course, we all know the saying, right? There's no, there's no, if there's no earth, there's no life. How else do we say it? There's no planet B. But are we taking their futures serious enough to change our present? And as Christians, I think we have to ask ourselves this. They are rarely told that these realities are the result of our failure to see them as spiritual issues. Do we do a good enough job at addressing environmental degradation and consequently their children's futures as a matter of faith? I think one of the saddest realities that we are heading into is the day when a young child will look up at the stars and the constellation, and instead of seeing God's beautiful creation, they'll see thousands of satellites swirling about in the sky. And that is to even say that they're not going to be so addicted to even remember to look up from their screen. So let's move into some hope. We humans have a special vocation within the created order. The hearts of those who are seeking to be united with God burn with a love for the whole of creation, with fellow humans, even those we might not agree with politically, with fellow birds, fellow cattle, fellow trees, fellow lakes, for there is an immense compassion that seizes the heart of the followers of Yahweh. Conversion and repentance come when we face the suffering and the loss that's visible to us in nature and in humanity. And it is in part the task of theology to make visible this face. This is learning to extend our hearts in a love of God that requires a love of neighbor and a love of the created universe. We practice the dominion of God when we behold the beauty and its paralleled response of awe and unexpected joy. To recognize it all as good, as it says in Genesis, is to awaken love. We tap our capacity to love. Beauty taps our capacity to love. And the young people know this, and they are demanding a better way. But it's not just the youth and the seekers waiting to rediscover God in the wild. You see, a very interesting thing has happened since we started UP Wild Church just a year and a half ago. Over half of the people who attend UP Wild Church have a very strong, traditional, and active church life. So, what does this tell us? That we need to keep providing guidance for people in how to respond to the pressing issues of our time. It might also tell us that in the UP, people don't mind meeting when it's 15 degrees outside, safely around a bonfire. We've witnessed that a fully lived out spiritual connection and recognition of creation within our worship brings about healing. Why? Because the liberation and reconciliation of all things is a single work of salvation. The praise of all creation rings out, and we join our voices together. We gather as one congregation rather than walled off from them. Where there has been absence and exclusion, let us create spaces where rediscovering God in the created order becomes habitual. Therefore, we begin to fall back in love, not only with creation, but with God. So let's create a discussion on how we all can do this in our own contexts and in our own bioregions, because it's going to look very different for all of us. Do we read more Psalms, pick spiritually, ecology-minded books for our book club? Do we include a prayer petition for the now extinct Jelpa salamander and the 36,000 other species on the red list for 2021? Do we provide our congregations with ways in which we can repent and change our ways? Do we fully utilize and go into the green spaces around our churches? Do we go into the wild, literally? And then do we internalize that within our hearts so that it becomes a habitual spiritual practice? So, my advice is realize that your time in and with nature is a spiritual practice. Turn off your screens as much as possible. Make time in the wild daily. Practice that on a daily basis, even when you don't want to go outside or go into your wild space, to form yourself into a deeper relationship with God. And then share your experience of how you discover God in the wild with us, because the UP Wild community is here to foster those connections and to help people start their journey into the wild. So I just want to thank you for this discussion today, and may the light of Christ enlighten all. Thank you.